Folks, I'm getting over a very nasty cold, let me tell you. I've still been keeping up with my reading, but we have a lot to catch up on here. The first order of business is to take a look at the Heroes of Olympus. I've been reading this series with my book club for the past several months, and we finally just finished it. Now, this is sort of going to be a follow-up to my Percy Jackson video I did a while ago, where I talked about the series, what it was like reading it as an adult, if it held up well. It absolutely did, and I would recommend you go watch it just to be caught up. So the original series was obviously a massive success. And 2010 was definitely its peak of popularity, with the original series recently concluding and with a new movie coming out. We don't need to mention that movie again, but the series was doing very well, so it didn't really take Rick Riordan long to make a new one. So just the year after The Last Olympian, Uncle Rick decided to continue his story in the Heroes of Olympus series. This was comprised of 5 books, where once again we return to Camp Half-Blood, follow all of the characters we know and love as they have to face a new threat. But things are a little bit different this time. One of Rick's inspirations for wanting to continue was the fact that he had so much more mythology that had been untapped in the original series. And while he would expand into other mythologies with other book series, there was still so much left to do with the Greek stuff that, why not make more Percy Jackson books? But he did throw in a bit of a twist this time around, introducing the Romans. The thing about Greek and Roman mythology is that it's kind of the same. Like, things have different names, but there's a lot of parallels and counterparts. So what Rick decided, instead of making a completely separate thing with all these new Roman gods, is just say, hey, the Greek and Roman gods are the same people. Sometimes they're just in a silly, goofy mood and they turn into their Roman form. And if they have a child born when they're in that form, then instead of going to Camp Half-Blood, they will go to Camp Jupiter, which is a whole other camp for children of the Roman gods. Now, here's the thing. I remember being 12 years old when this book came out and thinking, this is kind of a dumb idea. Do you mean to tell me that this whole time there was another camp full of demigods and they were just never referenced before? So it was actually kind of surprising to see it kind of worked the way they explain it. I kind of bought it. I'm like, okay, fine. Go for it. Something else that's interesting about this series is that while the first one was all following Percy's perspective, the Heroes of Olympus expands to 9 different POV characters. You're saying that's a lot? Yes. That's kind of a lot, especially for a children's series. It is broken up, however, in that you'll only be following maximum 4 or 5 per book. So with some fresh new ideas, Rick went ahead and shot this out in the span of 5 years. So is this series able to reach the heights of the previous one, or does it sort of falter in comparison? Let's take a look. The first 2 books here are sort of companion pieces, okay? We are introduced to a new demigod, Jason Grace, who wakes up in Camp Half-Blood with no memories. And then in the second book, we are introduced again to Percy Jackson, who wakes up in Camp Jupiter with no memories. But this isn't the only weird thing that's going on, as the monsters who are constantly tracking down and attempting to kill the demigods do not seem to be able to die. And with the evil Earth Mother Gaia returning, things have definitely been better for our heroes. There was also a reason why Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter were sort of kept away from each other, because now that they have rediscovered each other, they are preparing to go to war. So it's up to all of our demigod friends, both old and new, to attempt to unite both of the camps and defeat the armies of darkness. Again! I want to start this by saying I have a bit of a different perspective going into this one. While I was trying to be as fair as possible with the original series, it was impossible to deny my nostalgic attachment to it. That doesn't really exist here. In fact, these 2 are the only books I read when they were new. The Lost Hero and The Son of Neptune. And I don't really think these 2 books really get to the meat of what the Heroes of Olympus is like, because as I said before, they are companion books and they are both pretty much introduction books to the series. But it isn't really until the following 3 books that we see what Rick had been cooking. Because the first 2 were very reminiscent of the original series. They go on classic quests, run into a bunch of silly little monsters, fight a big boss at the end, you know the good stuff. But once all the characters come together and figure out what's going on, we pretty much just get one big massive main adventure throughout these 3 books. And for the most part, I think Rick still has it. I think invigorating the series with a lot of new elements really helped it, as each new monster monster or villain encounter was a bit more unpredictable in this one. Because not only do you have monsters that you know coming back from the dead, but of course you have new monsters we haven't seen before, as well as you have all these ancient Greek figures who, you know, died back then. They are also coming back too. So a lot of famous people you know from the myths might also show up. I think Rick also did a really good job sort of expanding, you know, this modern Greek mythology world he has built. I mentioned before that I do think that the way he weaved all of the Roman stuff into it was pretty good and pretty smart. And I like the reasons given for why we didn't see the Romans in the previous series. Most of our main cast here is comprised of new demigods. We have Jason, Leo, Piper, Hazel, and Frank, who for the most part have pretty compelling stories. Of course, they all come from vastly different backgrounds, and it was always fun sort of learning their unique backstories, learning who their godly parents were, what powers they have, and seeing them all interact, become friends was wonderful. So there's all this new stuff, but we are still, you know, going back to Camp Half-Blood, going back to all of the old characters we have grown to love. Obviously Percy, we have Annabeth and Nico too, having like a huge spotlight put on them, having their own POV sections in this series. And while it was fun learning about the new characters, it was even more fun following up with our characters from the previous series, seeing what they've been up to and seeing their characters grow even further. Rick still remains, I think, a very smart author when it comes to writing for children in particular. We know kids will be able to connect with these characters, relate to them, and put themselves into these sprawling adventures, which are still filled with fun twists, a lot of fun encounters with monsters, and some very engaging climactic battles. You see, while I think this series does keep some of the magic, and you know, some of its plot revelations and story arcs, and especially its characters, I think in terms of pacing and story structure, this one is a bit rough around the edges. While I greatly enjoyed rereading the original series, there were a few times that it would start to lose me a little bit, mostly in the first two books, where it just became a bit exhausting how they were constantly running into these monsters that you knew they were going to defeat. There's going to be some weakness that they're going to exploit. It's a very solid formula that I think works for a children audience, but this is when I think you start to lose older readers. And as you could tell, these books are way longer than the originals, which makes sense because you have so many more characters to juggle. But the problem is that amid all of the interesting stuff going on, there is a lot of what I would consider to be bloat in this series. Because if you weren't vibing with a certain encounter or section in the previous books, they would be over very quickly. But here, not only are encounters longer, but there are far more of them. And not only did it become a bit more exhausting, but it became predictable too, more than I thought the original series was, because these books follow a very strict structure. 4 chapters with one character, 4 chapters with one character, 4 chapters with one character, repeat. And you always knew that a conflict would be introduced in these 4 chapters and be resolved by the end. I think this is kind of genius when it comes to writing for children, especially dividing these sections into 4 chapters, because you keep having these moments where it's like, oh, cliffhanger, what's going to happen? And of course, if you're a kid with no attention span, you'll want to keep reading. But if you're an adult who's used to reading like 100-page chapters, this can get very tired and gimmicky. Now, there are some interesting plot elements that Rick throws in sometimes. For example, the House of Hades, you have our characters split up, so every time the POV changes, we're in a different location. And I do think that helped keep things a bit fresh. And you know, compared with the good elements of these books, I did find myself having a pretty enjoyable time throughout most of this series. But holy mother of Christ, I was very excited to read The Blood of Olympus, because as you know, I hold The Last Olympian to an extremely high regard. Like, I genuinely think that book is pretty much perfect for what it needed to be, and is like a masterclass of children's fantasy. So with how good that turned out, I was, you know, kind of expecting something like at least half as good for the finale. And while I was reading through this book, I noticed something a little weird, you know. While it was pretty much on par with the rest of the story, it didn't really feel like we were building up to anything, or at least not anytime soon. You know, there was always this growing sense of, you know, holy crap, the world's about to end in the first series, and here, while like that's still kind of happening, the fact that it is still following this 4-chapter per person structure, and things are still sort of happening at the same pace they have always happened, I found myself getting a little bit worried that they wouldn't stick the landing. They don't. The ending is terrible. Not necessarily for the characters, I want to say. Like, I think the characters are Rick Riordan's most consistent aspect, and I think the endings for some of these characters was great and really satisfying. But the actual plot here, I don't know what happened. It feels like Rick sort of wrote himself into a corner, like he just built up so much stuff that was happening, but he didn't really know how to deliver it with all of these different, characters in the mix. The actual climax of this book is pretty much a joke, and I really could not believe what I was reading. Okay, Gaia might be the worst, villain that this series has had, which is not a good thing, because she's basically the Kronos of the Heroes of Olympus. Every time Kronos showed up, it was like a huge oh shit moment. But here I just couldn't believe Gaia was such a joke, my god. Now listen, I'm not going to be too much harder on this book. I know it's for children. A lot of children probably were not fazed by this ending at all and just thought it was another goofy fun adventure. Sure. But as someone who genuinely really loved the last series, I am a bit disappointed that Rick couldn't really recapture it again. So while I am definitely glad I read The Heroes of Olympus, and it does have a lot of good elements, I think this one might be better left for the kiddos. I'll tell anyone to go read Percy Jackson, a great read at any age, but I feel like I can only really recommend this one to, massive fans who really need to see what happens to these characters, because I really just think that The Last Olympian was a much more satisfying ending. Now, as for me, do I intend to continue on? Because, of course, there have been many, many more books in this series. And I'll say, for now, I'm only committed to Percy Jackson 6, which comes out in the fall. It is the official 6th Percy Jackson and the Olympians book, which takes place after the Heroes of Olympus, but before the trials of Apollo and the Sun and the Star. As for those 6 books, I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe someday, but it will probably be a while. I also got to say, while the Heroes of Olympus was set up pretty seamlessly in The Last Olympian, the Trials of Apollo setup here felt kind of forced. Those are my thoughts on this series. Let me know in the comments below if you guys grew up with it, if you've read these books, what did you think about them when you first read them, what do you think about them now, and if you've read the Trials of Apollo, how do you think that series compares? For now, I have some more videos to catch up on. I'm still going to do Red Rising before Lightbringer comes out, but we're going to be doing the Dresden Files next. I read that when I was sick. Well, I'll see you then.